Hi, this is Dr. Kelly again. This might be the most biochemically challenging part of the webinar, but I often find that if you understand the reasons why, it's easier to make the behavioral change. So let's jump in here. This slide's sort of busy, but remember I talked about gluten having two proteins, gliadin being one and glutenin being the other. Well, gliadin is actually the protein that's mostly the troublemaker, and the body forms an antibody to this gliadin, and then it creates a complex that itself creates an inflammatory reaction. Of course, that's what the body does when the antibody develops. It wants to destroy that antigen. So the inflammation therein leads to, in the gut in particular, it leads to a leaky gut. Every organ has a different reaction to inflammation, but in this case, your gut, your colon, and your small intestine actually gets a bit leaky. So some of the things that were never intended to leave, but rather they actually leave and influence the rest of the body. And you'll see in step 5 that this antibody gliadin complex actually gets through a very stellar shield known as the blood-brain barrier. As I mentioned before, the brain doesn't like certain things in its environment, but this complex can get through. And here's the challenge. Some of the protein cells in the brain actually look very much like gliadin, and the body cannot always tell the difference. So what happens now is this antibody gliadin complex, not telling the difference, actually starts to invade and destroy some of the brain cells, the normal natural brain cells, and that creates, of course, breakdown and the proclivity for neurodegenerative challenges, including senility and Alzheimer's. The next piece, somewhat unrelated, is the effect that gluten has on the brain. Because sugar and gluten are often connected, given the fact that they're in the pastries and the muffins and the cookies that we're eating. And as you recall, one of the first steps when we're taking in too much sugar is we actually develop insulin resistance, meaning that the cells are so tired of being asked to take in more sugar that they stop paying attention to the insulin. Well, what happens in the central nervous system or in the brain when you have insulin resistance? It helps to create plaques in the brain, and this is what we're seeing on MRI that's often leading towards Alzheimer's disease. So while I cannot say definitively that gluten causes Alzheimer's, I will tell you the literature is very pointing and leading towards this direction. And when you read the book Grain Brain, as I mentioned in the previous section, you will see the science behind it at a much greater level. When we talk about gluten, we always think of generally having pain in the gut, and as I indicated, gluten doesn't just affect the brain and the gut, but it affects both, and sometimes other organs as well. The difference is this: when it starts to influence the gut, you can feel it. Your stomach feels horrible. You actually can sense that pain. However, the brain does not have pain receptors, so the destruction, sadly, is silent until the cognitive duress from Alzheimer's becomes obvious to others. The other piece that gluten does, and I think is very important to recognize in the brain, is that it actually breaks down in your stomach, particularly into what we call polypeptides, another variety of proteins. These polypeptides also get through that protective shield in the brain, the blood-brain barrier, and they attach to and stimulate the morphine receptors, which give you this fantastic happy feeling. These are actually the very same receptors that opioids contact with when you take those medications. And so what's happening is we get this incredible high from the gluten, and the food manufacturers recognize that, hence one of the reasons why they continue to put more gluten in their food, because it's really all about profit at the end of the day for these large companies. And that's why you kind of feel a little bit nutty sometimes when you think, I'd be willing to drive 10 or 20 miles out of the way to get something that tastes good, that cookie or that muffin or that donut, because you're actually grossly addicted to it. And the good news is you can actually break that addiction by recognizing that it exists and replacing foods. So the next section is what the heck to do about all this. It's one thing to understand that challenge, it's a whole other thing to try to fix it. So hold on, we'll be starting that webinar in just a few moments.